David knelt in the hospital corridor, the cold tiles pressing through his trousers as he held out a small velvet ring box toward Clara. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, casting pale shadows on his dark skin and highlighting the faint tremble in his fingers. David was tall, broad-shouldered, and usually calm, the kind of man whose quiet strength made people trust him without trying. He worked as a civil engineer, respected for his discipline, and the way he carried himself like someone who understood responsibility, down to the last grain of sand. Clara, slim with expressive eyes and soft brown skin, stood before him in her neatly pressed dress, her braids pulled into a simple bun that bounced slightly when she breathed. She was a schoolteacher, loved in her community for her gentle manner and confidence that glowed without effort. When she looked at David kneeling there, her heart stumbled. She had waited so long for this moment that it felt unreal, like a dream she had tiptoed into by accident. The hallway buzzed with activity nurses moving with urgency, the distant cries of a newborn, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the aroma of fried plantain drifting from the hospital canteen downstairs. Clara reached a shaky hand to her chest, and David's deep voice rose, steady at first, telling her she was the woman who lit the quiet corners of his life, the one he wanted to build a lifetime with, the one who made him feel like home wasn't a place but a person. She swallowed a small laugh as she blinked back tears, unable to stop herself from whispering, "Well, look at you, surprising me like a market hawker shouting last price." Her voice trembled but carried warmth, hope, and the softness that came from loving someone wholeheartedly. She was about to answer, her lips parting, when a commotion broke sharply through the air. A nurse sprinted past, her shoes slapping the floor, waving a chart as she shouted that his wife was in labor. The words cut through the corridor and echoed against the white walls like a stone thrown into calm water. Clara felt the entire building tilt beneath her feet. She turned fully toward the nurse, then slowly back to David, her body stiffening as if her bones had forgotten their purpose. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time she saw fear creep along his jawline, settling beneath his expression like a shadow he could not hide. She heard her own voice ask him which wife, the question trembling like a bird trapped between her ribs. David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat locked, and the ring in his hand dipped slightly as his grip weakened. The corridor around them seemed to quiet, every sound suddenly distant, like the world was holding its breath with her. Clara thought of the long walks they had shared through busy streets filled with yellow minibuses and vendors, selling roasted corn, the late-night conversations where he told her he valued honesty more than gold, the small gifts he left at her door on Friday evenings. She thought of the trust she had placed in him, the way she believed she knew the shape of his world. Now, that world cracked open before her, spilling confusion at her feet. A passing relative carrying a bag of oranges muttered that people truly hide inside their own shadows, and Clara almost felt the words land on her skin. David tried to speak again, but his voice came out rough, like gravel dragged across a road. Clara stepped back, her palm lifting slightly, as if to shield herself from the truth forming on his face. She felt heat climb her neck, her heart pounding so loudly that she feared the entire hospital could hear its frantic rhythm. The nurse disappeared around the corner, calling again for the husband to come quickly, and David flinched as though the words physically struck him. His silence became heavier, settling between them like thick harmattan dust that refused to be swept away. Clara stared at him, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of pain, disbelief, and a rising storm she struggled to contain. Her breath grew tight as she asked again, "Softer than before, David. Which wife are they calling?" Her fingers trembled as memories pressed against her. His strange late calls, the moments he disappeared without explanation, the times he avoided certain questions with jokes that sounded too light to be innocent. Even the proverb her grandmother always said returned to her mind, When a drum changes rhythm, the dancer must pay attention. David lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes, and the corridor's bright lights made the sweat on his forehead glisten. Clara felt her world slipping into a place she did not recognize, a place where love was suddenly a question with no answer. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that still carried the weight of 1,000 storms. "David, are you married?" He froze, overcome by something she could not name: guilt, fear, or a secret he had spent too long trying to bury. His lips parted, but no sound followed. His silence wrapped around her like cold wind, and she stood there, waiting, her heart bracing for whatever truth he was afraid to speak. Clara pulled David down the long hospital corridor, her hand clamped around his wrist, as though holding the very last piece of strength she had left. The overhead lights cast pale streaks across their dark skin, and her brown face, usually calm and warm, twitched with a storm she could no longer contain. She dragged him past nurses in green scrubs, past patients sitting on plastic chairs, past the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with roasted corn drifting from the street outside. They ended in a quiet corner near the staircase, where the walls were cracked at the edges, and the window shutters rattled softly in the afternoon breeze. David, tall with a broad chest and smooth ebony skin, looked like a man whose confidence had been yanked out by the roots. People usually admired him for his charm, his steady voice, and the way he carried himself like someone raised by elders who taught him honor. But now, his shoulders drooped as Clara turned to him, her eyes fierce, her voice trembling as she demanded the truth. She wasn't interested in half-baked excuses. Her dark braids swung around her face as she stepped closer, telling him to drop the pretense. She wanted the truth naked, not wrapped in sweet stories. David rubbed the back of his neck, sweat forming along his hairline, and muttered that he had been planning to solve everything soon. Clara let out a dry laugh, the kind that sounded like it hurt her ribs. She asked him what exactly he was planning to solve, because from where she was standing, everything looked like a mess she didn't cause. David leaned back against the wall, staring at the floor as though the right words were hidden in the stains on the tiles. His voice broke slightly as he admitted that he was married. The word rolled out slowly, thick like heavy harmattan air. Clara froze. Her dark skin seemed to pale in shock, her lips parting as though air refused to enter her lungs. David added the name Rosa woman he said he had married years before, a woman with whom things had become complicated. He insisted the marriage had problems, that he was no longer happy, that he had been trying to figure out a way forward before meeting Clara. As he spoke, Clara felt her throat burn. She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth as the betrayal sank in. She had always seen him as a man who stood tall among others, someone who spoke with gentle authority, someone shaped by a family that believed in dignity and hard work. She remembered the evenings they spent walking near the bus park, yellow minibuses honking while street vendors shouted prices of suya. She remembered the conversations about dreams, family, and a future he claimed he wanted with her. Her chest tightened, her eyes filled with tears before she could stop them, warm tears sliding down her cheeks, catching the afternoon light. She asked him why he didn't tell her, why he allowed her heart to fall so deeply when his was divided. David reached out, trying to touch her arm, but she stepped back sharply, refusing even the warmth of his fingers. Her voice rose louder as she asked if Rose knew about her. The words shot out like arrows, carrying the weight of pain and humiliation she could barely keep inside. A group of people walking by slowed down, their dark faces turning briefly toward the commotion before minding their own business again, the way people in a busy African hospital often did when trouble hung in the air. David hesitated. His lips parted, closed, parted again, but no explanation came. Clara's heart pounded. Her breath came in sharp bursts, as though her own ribs were squeezing her lungs. She repeated the question, her finger pointed at him with trembling precision. David looked like a man crushed by the weight of his own choices, his handsome features strained, his usually steady hands shaking. The air between them felt heavy, thick enough to cut with a knife. Before he could answer, a nurse rushed toward them, her dark skin glowing with sweat, her voice slicing through the tension as she called his name. She told him urgently that his wife was calling from the labor room, calling his name loudly, asking for him. Clara's heart dropped. David's breath hitched. The corridor seemed to fall into silence for a heartbeat. Then everything moved at once, David stepping back, the nurse gesturing frantically, Clara gripping her chest as though trying to hold her heart together. The truth she had been demanding slipped away again, swallowed by the urgency of another woman's pain. David stepped into the labor room with his heart thudding hard against his ribs, every beat echoing the fear he had tried to swallow since the truth spilled from Clara's lips. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, warm from the harsh lights overhead. Rose lay on the bed, her dark brown skin glistening with sweat, her tightly coiled natural hair pushed back by a hospital band. Her eyes sharp, unblinking, unafraid, cut through him the moment he entered. She was a woman known for her strength, raised around elders who taught her that life would test her, but she must meet it with dignity. Even now, fighting a wave of pain, she held herself like someone who refused to let suffering shake her spirit. The nurse, a dark-skinned woman with braided hair under her cap, moved briskly around the room, adjusting Rose's position and murmuring calm instructions. David took a careful step forward, but Rose lifted her chin slightly, the gesture small yet powerful, the kind that told him she saw through every lie he ever considered telling. Another contraction ripped through her, and she clutched the sides of the bed, breathing loudly. Yet as the pain eased, she spoke with a calmness that unsettled the room. She told him she knew everything. Her voice was soft, steady, and without a tremor, even though her body trembled with exhaustion. David blinked fast, shaking his head instinctively, panic flooding his eyes. He denied it, stumbling over his words, trying to paint new shadows over the old ones. But Rose simply exhaled, the kind of exhale someone uses when they already resolved their battle long before the other person arrived. She told him she saw the messages. Not one, not two. Enough to convince her that the man she married, this tall, carved from stone, African man with his deep voice and steady walk had already walked away from their union long before this pregnancy. Outside the half-open door, Clara's back pressed against the wall, her breathing shallow as she tried to remain invisible. Her dark skin seemed dim under the fluorescent lights as she leaned closer, unable to resist hearing the truth unfold like a wound being reopened. The corridor behind her buzzed with activity voices exchanging greetings, footsteps, a vendor shouting the price of roasted plantain outside the hospital gate. But inside this small space, silence stretched tightly. Rose lifted her eyes again, and David felt the weight of them like stones pressing hard against his chest. She told him she had already decided to leave once the baby arrived, that she had prayed, cried, begged life to give her a sign, and then found the messages that became the answer. David's breath shook. His hands trembled. This was the woman who had built a home with him, a woman with obsidian dark skin and full lips that once smiled easily at him. A woman who had grown up dancing at family gatherings with drums pounding through the night. Now she spoke to him like she had finally embraced a painful truth he refused to accept. Clara blinked rapidly as fresh sadness washed through her, hearing Rosie's strength even in weakness. Rose added that she might be weak in body today, but she was not blind. Then she turned her face away and gripped the bed frame as another contraction rolled through her like thunder. Her voice low, but still certain. David stepped back, his mind spinning, realizing he was losing everything. His marriage, his dignity, and perhaps even the child now fighting its way into the world. He looked toward the door, unknowingly locking eyes with Clara for a brief second before she slipped back into shadow, pressing her palm against her mouth to steady her breathing. The nurse urged Rose to keep pushing, her voice calm but firm, guiding her through the rhythm of the pain. The room trembled with tension as Rose held onto her strength, her dark knuckles turning pale from gripping the sheets. David wanted to speak, to explain, to undo every mistake he had made, but his words felt useless, like pouring water into a basket. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away sharply, focusing on her breathing as the pressure built in her body. Clara's chest tightened as she listened, each word striking her like whispers she could never forget. David's life, once structured and admirable, now teetered like a clay pot on the edge of a table. He could feel everything slipping, one truth at a time. Suddenly a piercing cry filled the air, the baby's first sound, raw and loud. The nurse lifted the newborn, a tiny dark-skinned child wailing beneath the harsh lights. For a moment, everything stilled. The room felt holy, like the air itself paused to honor the arrival of new life. David took a shaky step forward, tears forming in his eyes, but Rose turned her head slowly to him, her expression calm yet cold, her voice stripped of emotion as she whispered that after today he would face the consequences. Clara's breath caught. The baby's cry echoed through the room, and David felt the world he built crumble at his feet, one heartbeat at a time. Clara staggered out of the labor room area first, her dark brown skin flushed with shock, her braids trembling around her face as she tried to breathe through the storm tearing through her chest. The corridor hummed with life nurses passing quickly, a cleaner pushing a mop bucket, relatives murmuring prayers under their breath. But Clara felt as if the world had narrowed to a single suffocating point. She pressed her back to the wall, sliding down slightly, her hands shaking as though grief itself lived inside her bones. David hurried after her, his tall, broad-shouldered frame looking suddenly small, weakened by fear and regret. His deep ebony skin glistened with sweat, his breath uneven as he reached for her. But Clara jerked back, eyes red, voice cracked as she told him not to touch her. Every memory of their moments, walks near the market stalls where roasted corn scented the air, their quiet laughter under palm trees in the evening breeze. The warmth of his hand brushing hers now felt poisoned. David sank to a crouch beside her, saying he loved her, that his heart chose her, that he had been drowning in a marriage long dead. But Clara's voice rose in sharp disbelief, trembling with hurt, telling him she refused to fight another black woman over a man who hid the truth behind sweet words. She reminded him that her mother raised her to respect herself before anything else, and she would not be another woman's shadow. Their argument grew louder, echoing off the corridor walls. People passing by turned briefly, some shaking their heads with quiet sympathy, because in their community, heartbreak was not a secret. It was something that lived in the air, in proverbs older than time, in the eyes of elders who said a man's character is tested not by his promises, but by his choices. David begged again, voice cracking, insisting he needed her. Clara stepped away from him, wiping her face with trembling fingers, whispering that she felt used, deceived, discarded. She said she had walked into love with bare feet and had stepped on thorns he planted. She turned from him, hugging herself tightly, just as the labor room door creaked open behind them. Rose emerged in a wheelchair, pushed gently by a nurse whose dark arms were strong and steady from years of lifting children and calming mothers. Rose's complexion glowed with exhaustion, a deep mahogany brown that seemed almost luminous under the corridor lights. Her natural curls were damp with sweat, her wrapper loosely tied around her waist, her newborn wrapped in a soft, patterned cloth resting against her chest. She looked fragile and powerful at once, like someone who had fought through pain and found a new kind of clarity on the other side. The nurse murmured a greeting to Clara before stepping aside, allowing Rose to face both of them. Rose's eyes swept from David's hunched frame to Clara's tear-streaked face. She breathed out slowly, one hand resting on her child's back as she spoke with a calmness that silenced every sound around them. She told Clara not to let David destroy her life the way he destroyed hers. Her voice carried the weight of a woman raised among strong aunties and stern grandmothers in a rural compound with red soil paths and cassava farms. Women who believed that heartbreak was not the end of a woman's dignity. She told Clara that she deserved better than to inherit another woman's wounds. David stumbled to his feet, stunned, torn between the two women whose worlds he had collided. He moved toward Rose, trying to defend himself, insisting he meant no harm, that things spiraled beyond his control, that he loved Clara but respected Rose. Rose gave a tired laugh, the kind that held no joy, only truth. She said respect starts where lies end, and he had ended nothing. Clara's breath trembled as she listened, her anger slowly being replaced by something deeper, a kind of mourning for what she thought she had. Rose adjusted her child in her arms, her movements gentle, deliberate, like someone who knew she had stepped into a new chapter, whether she wanted to or not. David reached out helplessly between them, his hands shaking, voice cracking as he begged them both to listen. Clara stepped forward slowly, her steps measured, her shoulders trembling but lifted with new resolve. She told David she was done, that she was walking away, that she refused to bind her future to a man who left pieces of himself scattered in lies. Her voice was soft but strong, shaped by a childhood in a lively neighborhood, where elders sat outside on low stools telling stories about choosing wisely and protecting one's heart. She began to walk down the corridor, her slippers tapping steadily against the floor. David moved quickly, grabbing her wrist before she could take another step. Clara froze, her chest rising sharply as she turned. People in the hallway glanced again, some whispering, some pitying, some shaking their heads in that familiar way of acknowledging that every home has its own fire. David whispered her name, begging, voice filled with desperation that made his hands tremble. But Clara stood tall, her dark skin glowing under the hallway lights, her expression resolute as she gently pulled her hand from his grasp. She told him he had lost everything: his marriage, her trust, and any chance of recovery. Her voice carried the calm finality of a closed door. She said he should not follow her, not speak, not try to gather broken pieces he had shattered himself. Rose watched quietly from her wheelchair, her newborn shifting softly against her chest as though sensing the tension. David stepped back, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, eyes wide with the weight of everything collapsing around him. Clara turned and walked away, her silhouette growing smaller with each step. David stood frozen, shaking, his life unraveling in the middle of the busy hospital corridor where voices, footsteps, and distant city noise blended into one endless reminder of what he had done. Clara walked out of the hospital with steps that wavered at first, then steadied as she cleared the doorway, and the warm afternoon air touched her face. Her brown skin glowed faintly beneath the sun, though her eyes still glistened with fresh pain. Yellow minibuses honked on the road outside. Hawkers called out prices of roasted corn and spicy skewers, and the scent of fried plantain drifted from a nearby stall. But the lively atmosphere of the city felt distant to her, as if she were walking through sound and color wrapped in a thin veil of heartbreak. She pulled her phone from her bag with shaking hands and blocked David's number without hesitation, choosing quiet over chaos. Her mind replayed how she had once trusted him, how she had opened her heart the way her aunties always said a woman should, slowly, carefully, with both eyes wide open. Yet she had still fallen into a web woven with soft words and hidden truths. As she crossed the parking lot, she reminded herself she was raised in a community where women were taught to value peace more than sweet promises. She whispered under her breath that she would choose peace, even if it meant stepping away with a wounded heart. Inside the hospital corridor, David sat alone in the same spot he had knelt to propose, his tall frame bent forward, elbows on his knees, fingers tangled together. His deep ebony skin looked pale under the bright lights, and his usually confident posture sagged as though the world rested on his back. He replayed Clara's words, Rose's voice, the nurse's expression, and every mistake he made that led to this moment. People passed him with quick glances, some pitying, some indifferent, some shaking their heads with a quiet understanding that every man reaps what he sows. A cleaner pushing her bucket paused briefly near him, her voice soft as she reminded him that when a drum is beaten, it must answer the rhythm it created. David nodded weakly, but the words only deepened the ache inside him. Meanwhile, Clara kept walking, her steps small but determined. She brushed away the last of her tears and promised herself she would rebuild, that her heart was still hers to protect, that she would never again ignore the small warnings life whispered before a storm. Her thoughts drifted to the laughter she once shared with David, the evenings they spent strolling past fabric shops where bright Ankara cloths fluttered in the breeze. Those memories stung, but she refused to let them chain her. Rose sat in her hospital room now, her newborn resting in the curve of her arm, as sunlight filtered through the window, casting warm lines across her dark mahogany skin. Her natural curls were tied loosely, framing a face that looked both exhausted and triumphant. The nurse helped her adjust her wrapper before stepping out, leaving Rose to observe her child with a softness that came from deep within her. She thought of the red soil roads of her childhood home, the cassava farms that stretched behind her family house, and the aunties who taught her that a woman must know when to stay and when to walk away. Filing for divorce was not a decision she made lightly, but it was the kind of decision she made with clarity, shaped by the need to protect her own spirit. She had already spoken to her elder sister, who offered to stay with her for the first few weeks, and her family had promised to support her as she stepped into motherhood alone. The thought steadied her heart. She had always been valued for her resilience, her determination, and her steady wisdom, and now she would draw on all of that to build a peaceful life for herself and her child. Outside, David remained in the corridor, staring at the spot where Rose had warned him of consequences, where Clara had walked away from him. His mind spun as though trying to grasp the shape of a life that no longer belonged to him. He thought back to his upbringing, raised by a father who worked in a noisy market filled with bargaining voices and a mother who sold fruits under a huge umbrella near a busy bus park. Those lessons of honesty, patience, and responsibility echoed now like distant drums he had ignored for too long. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but every message was a notification telling him the number he tried to call was no longer reachable. Clara's number. The woman he claimed he loved. The woman he betrayed by weaving two worlds into one fragile lie. He placed his face in his hands, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of losing both relationships. His chest tightened as he wondered what might have been if he had chosen truth early enough. But the footsteps of regret were louder now, echoing, persistent, unforgiving. Clara reached the roadside, her body still trembling with emotion, but she paused for a moment as a yellow minibus screeched to a stop. The conductor leaned out, shouting the route in the familiar rhythm of the city, but Clara waved him off gently. She needed a moment to breathe. She needed to feel the world moving around her while she stayed still, watching, thinking, healing. Her dark eyes followed the movement of people crossing the road, A mother tying her baby more tightly to her back. A man carrying a sack of yam over his shoulder. School children laughing as they bought puff puff from a vendor. Life continued. And she decided she would continue too, even if her heart was bruised. She whispered to herself that she would not let deceit carve scars she could never heal. She would not allow someone else's lie to redirect the path her life could take. As she stepped away from the hospital entrance, a soft breeze pushed against her face, warm and reassuring. She walked toward the bus stop with a small, steady confidence, like someone returning to her own skin. Back inside, Rose's sister arrived to meet her, lifting the newborn gently and smiling with warmth. Rose felt tears fill her eyes, not of sadness this time, but of relief. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she was not alone. Family, community, and her own strength would guide her. She exhaled deeply, releasing the last pieces of bitterness lodged in her chest. She would rebuild from here, and she would raise her child with honesty, so they would never grow up in the shadow of a lie. At the far end of the hospital corridor, David finally stood, only to sink into a nearby chair again, drained to his core. He stared at the empty hallway where he once imagined a future with Clara. He looked toward the labor room where Rose gave birth to a child he barely had the courage to welcome. And he let reality settle fully. He had lost them both. His choices had carved an emptiness inside him that nothing could fill. For the first time, he felt the weight of a truth elders often said. A dishonest heart destroys its own happiness. The truth was no longer a proverb, it had become his life story. As the corridor buzzed around him with the sound of footsteps, new births, family laughter, and the rustle of life moving forward, David remained still, facing the final consequence of the lies he crafted. In the end, he learned the hardest lesson a man can learn. Trust once broken does not return. Love once betrayed does not stay. And happiness once taken for granted does not remain in the hands of someone who does not honor it.